The Rebel Capitalist Show.
All right, guys, it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome someone back to the Rebel Capitalist Show. He's my good buddy. He's the official lawyer of the Rebel Capitalist Show, by the way. His name is Robert Barnes. Robert, welcome back to the show, my friend.
Glad to be here.
Now, you are one of my favorite people to talk to because I always learn something new. And I want to start off by talking about a really hot topic here. And I want you to kind of give me the legal background on kind of what reality is and where the probabilities lie. First, tell me what's going on with the Trump ordeal. And then kind of from a legal standpoint, I've been hearing people say that, oh, well, he's never going to be able to do business again. He's going to go to jail. He's going to have all of his bank accounts seized. So I'm trying to sift through the sensational information out there and kind of what is real and what we should pay attention to.
Well, I'll say a couple of things. If I was talking to the president, and I did talk to him about a couple of months ago after the election, sort of laid back. He was in good spirits, so he's not worried. He wasn't worried then. He's not worried now about anything that anybody may be planning in terms of coming at him. He's always that, plan for the worst, hope for the best, but idealistic, optimistic guy, sometimes to a fault maybe. But he's not affected by anything that's coming. Though if I were talking to him, I'd probably tell him that Brazil looks really nice this time of year. Just in general, he has political protection down there. And if he's actually worried about the system coming after him, the place to go would be to hang out in Brazil. I'm sure the president would give him an extended visa or even second citizenship, which I'm telling everybody now's as good a time as any to have your backup plan in place, because this is what you have a backup plan in place for, even if you're the president of the United States, because you can see if they can take away his bank accounts overnight, cut off his credit overnight, cut off his capital overnight, cut off his contracts overnight, cut off his social media access while he's still president of the United States overnight,
right.
You get a sense of what they can do to any ordinary Joe or Schmo out there. And so if you don't have a backup plan, now's the time to get one. So and that's true for everybody, including, I have reason to believe the president has various backup plans ready to go.
Right.
So what you talked about, I think yesterday or the day before, it definitely was in motion before everything that's happened, which was he was going to help start his own social media platforms. Twitter may have been aware of that, so they may have been sort of jumping the gun by saying, it's the old, no, I dumped you before you dumped me routine.
Yeah.
Because I think he was planning on using Twitter to say, by the way, I'm leaving Twitter and this is the new platform to go to. And he just wasn't endorsing another platform until the Trumpster had a piece of it. So it's Trump being Trump. So he was going to wait till after he's out of office. He says, hey, you guys want me to monetize your platform? Why don't you give me an ownership piece? Or normally what he likes, he doesn't like ownership pieces. If you look at his real estate structures, he likes just a percentage of gross revenue for branding so that he doesn't have any legal liability or responsibility for the property itself. That's an old Trump tactic because it allows him to get out of Dodge if he needs to rather quickly. Now, it also facilitated people dumping him when it was convenient, but he gets paid either way. So when Panama or other places, when they had to take the Trump name off the hotel, he still gets paid under his contract, whether the name is still there or not there over the next 5-10 years. So I think he absolutely is planning on a Trump TV network. So, you were ahead of the curve at predicting that. That at least was the plan 2 months ago. So I don't anticipate that changing. That's why over the last year, he's been building up criticism of Fox. Man, Fox is terrible. Man, Fox is awful. Man, it wasn't just a political point. It's classic Trump. I mean, ever since Art of the Deal, he said always, it was my favorite thing when I was a little kid. I had two favorite books. One was Bobby Kennedy's old book, To a Newer World, his campaign text from 1968. And now I'm working with his son on lockdown lawsuits, which is fascinating. And my other one was Donald Trump's Art of the Deal, which my favorite quote in there was, always plan for the worst, but always hope for the best. So in other words, have a mindset that the best thing is going to happen, but have a preparation plan in place so that if the worst thing happens, you're prepared either way.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And that's very Trump.
Yeah, that's a common phrase we used to use in the business world was my entrepreneurial days. So as far as the whole impeachment process, what is going on with that? And why am I hearing these people on social media saying that Trump is going to jail? What is the rationale for that, or is that just sensationalism?
So I don't think the feds are going to do anything, but what you have is these very democratic jurisdictions weaponizing the prosecutorial process to take out their political adversaries. And there's always been some degree of that, but it's taken a whole different level in the Trump era. So Trump's presidency criminal exposure is from the city of New York, the state of New York, and the District of Columbia. Because they're extremely democratic jurisdictions, they would bring a prosecution either in the city of New York or D.C., where you're talking 92% of the voters disagree with Trump. And the prosecutors, like, for example, New York, the city prosecutors are about to have an election come this next year.
Right.
So what do you think they're going to run on? I'll put Donald Trump in prison. That kind of nonsense.
Oh, okay.
So that's where you're hearing that from. There's no basis to bring a tax prosecution. That would be a complete crock. I do a lot of criminal tax cases, and you have to prove that the person acted either in bad faith, in other words, they didn't think what they were doing was legal, and that they did not have any attorneys or accountants they relied upon. If it's called a reliance defense. So if you have a good faith defense, I thought what I was doing was legal. In Wesley Snipes' case, he got acquitted of half the misdemeanors and all of the felony charges for believing that he didn't have to pay taxes, period. So that gives you an idea for the scope of what a good faith defense can be.
And just to be clear, and you know that because you're representing him.
Yes, I was his counsel, exactly.
Yeah.
And a guy we both know, Peter Schiff's father, Erwin, was one of the famous people who helped put a lot of that into motion. They were never able to successfully prosecute him on his own tax structure because they knew he had a good faith belief that the tax laws did not require him to file or pay an individual income tax based on his interpretation and understanding of the law. So the good faith belief is very, very broad. And the best way to think of it is our founders recognize that there's two areas we don't want people to be in prison for as it relates to taxes, given how our country was founded, which is either debt or dissent. Just the fact that you owe a tax bill doesn't make you a criminal. And just the fact that you disagree with the IRS about the meaning of the tax laws doesn't make you a criminal. Or our founders were all a bunch of criminals because all of them had various degrees of tax debt, and all of them believed that the tax laws meant something different than the colonial authorities thought they meant. And so it's a recognition of our history that we don't put people in prison for those sort of things.
So where's the line in the sand? Like what happened with Erwin?
So the way they were ultimately able to target Erwin is two ways. First, selling his book was one of the ways. They came up with an exception to free speech based on commercial speech, which was a complete misapplication.
Wow.
That was part one. Part two was connecting other people that had taken Erwin's advice, and the idea was that Erwin had advised other people to do things that were illegal, and thus they were able. What happens is the jury is sitting there and not asking the question, does Erwin really believe it? They're asking the question, is it fair that somebody listened to Erwin and did what Erwin suggested? And so it changes the moral perspective of the jury away from what the legal constitutional filter is supposed to be. Though the only person I've ever been on the phone with that talked more than Donald Trump was Erwin Schiff. God bless him. He just goes and goes and goes and goes. He makes Trump look like a slow talker by comparison.
Well, that's where Peter gets it from then, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. I mean, just boom, 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 boom. But great guy, very conscientious guy. So in Trump's context, he didn't file a single tax return that wasn't prepared by all of his accountants or attorneys. So in order to prove that he did anything wrong, they're going to have to prove that Donald Trump, deliberately and knowingly hid information from his attorneys or accountants that was material for tax purposes. Trump has no incentive to do that. Not only that, because he's in the real estate business, he has 100 loopholes that are designed to facilitate real estate investment in the United States, as you know well. So that's mostly... The left thinks they can criminalize anything related to tax because it's so complicated. They can just stick a criminal label on anything that they want to and get away with it. The court system, however, is very careful about that because of how easily it can be politically abused and misused. My hunch is that they ultimately don't prosecute him in New York for anything related to either. They're looking at his taxes, they're looking at his charities, they're looking at bank structures. There's no way they can go at Trump without implicitly indicting half the real estate industry in the city of New York. And when New York real estate is taking a tank, is that the message they really want to send? Hey, don't come and invest in New York. Don't be any part of real estate in New York, or you're going to get trumped, because they'll criminally prosecute you for some part of your real estate deal that has been common industry practice for a better part of a century. So there's a lot of incentives for them not to actually go as far as they're bluffing.
Yeah, do you think they'll come after him, or can they come after him legitimately for anything that was done with the protests?
No, as both Professor Dershowitz has said, as Professor Turley, both of whom are on the left, everything Trump did was completely politically protected. So in the United States, in order to be prosecuted for incitement of a riot, they have to prove that you asked for express unlawful activity that could be imminently conducted. So to give an example, the most famous case is Brandenburg v. Ohio Klan rally, where they said, we're going to go do all these terrible things to the black community right down the street. And the Supreme Court said 9-0 unanimously, that's not a crime, because even though they expressly called for illegal activities to occur, they could not be done imminently. It's another part of the jurisprudence is called true threats jurisprudence. So people say a lot of dumb and crazy things all the time.
Right.
The reason why Madonna couldn't be prosecuted for saying she dreams of blowing up the White House is because it did not have an imminent risk of actually happening. So in order for a true threat to matter, it has to have imminent risk. So it's this combination of, did Trump expressly call for illegal activities? No, he didn't. Did he call for it in such a way that it could imminently occur? No, that was not the case either. So the lack of express calling for illicit activities and the lack of imminent action means he couldn't be blamed. In fact, he said just the opposite. He asked for a peaceful protest to occur. Not only that, there's also a but-for causation problem, proximate causation. Trump was still speaking when they started storming, the group that started storming the Capitol did so. The group that stormed the Capitol and started the Capitol Hill riots were not even at Trump's speech, because they started it 30 minutes before Trump even finished his speech. And they were more than a mile away from where Trump was giving his speech. So it appears, so there's no causal connection. There's no First Amendment conforming violation that could be alleged here. Independent legal professors have come to the same conclusion.
Right.
Now, there's an ugly history in America of us using sedition laws to do bad stuff. So Eugene V. Debs was put in prison solely for giving a speech against the war. So the fact that they are trying to weaponize this Capitol Hill riot into not only attacking the president's First Amendment rights and set a precarious precedent that your First Amendment no longer protects you if within 6 degrees of separation, they can blame you for something. I mean, they're now trying to say if you simply question the election, you incited a riot. I mean, and they want to call that conspiracy to commit sedition. The criminal sedition laws have an ugly history in America of using it. You combine conspiracy language with sedition language, and all of a sudden speech is a crime and a 20-year federal prison crime. And so it's scary and terrifying that they're even talking about doing this, but it's where the government is going.
I wanted to circle back quickly to that Trump News Network to get more of your opinion on that and maybe what you've heard, some insider information. Let's do that, and then I want to circle back to what you're just saying about free speech.
So yeah, Trump has been looking at it for a while. In fact, his thought process was to build an entire network, social media network of his own too.
Right.
So that you had, Trump Twitter rather than Twitter, Trump Facebook rather than Facebook, Trump, and then Trump TV, Trump podcast, Trump radio, Trump YouTube, you name it. The easiest place for him to take over or to have that influence was never Parler, which was sort of isolated as just a Twitter imitation, but was actually Gab. Now, Kushner and other people in the White House don't want him associated with Gab because Gab has everybody on it, good and bad. Gab really doesn't censor and suppress speech, though it does report people for illicit actions such as stalking, doxing, criminal harassment, calls for illicit incitement. Contrary to conventional wisdom, they are quick to criticize those actions, but they won't criticize any form of speech. So that means the alt-right and other people that are not really that likable do have platforms on Gab. But Gab has its own browser. Gab has its own servers. Gab has its own version of YouTube. Gab has its own versions of Twitter. Gab has its own versions of social media sites. So Gab is the most well-equipped if you wanted a one-stop shop, independent place that you could buy today and transform tomorrow, it would be Gab. Now, I don't know if Gab's going to be up for sale, but that would be an interesting component. But he was thinking of something like that, basically replacing Twitter, replacing Facebook, replacing Google, and replacing YouTube. And so as well as replacing Fox News and replacing Rupert Murdoch and newspapers too. He would like to own a few newspapers in the same way Murdoch does. A New York Post, a Washington Times, maybe a London or Australian newspaper, some and global influence. And Trump, in reality, even before he went to the White House, Trump had started to move into global branding. So, you had Trump hotels, Trump hotels were being built overseas than they were being built in the United States. Though almost all of those deals, contrary to conventional wisdom, usually were simply branding deals. He didn't own the land. He didn't own the building. He had no liability for the construction cost. It was just his name, and then he provided the managerial service. And at least in my experience, I always liked Trump hotels because I got consistent service no matter what. I'm always top 5-star level consistency in a way that, frankly, no other brand other than your more high end, more expensive, your Ritz's, your Four Seasons were able to consistently deliver. So I think Trump TV network makes eminent sense. Fox is getting crushed because of the decisions that they made. They're trying to change their entire schedule around because they think they can. The entire Republican establishment, including the board of Fox, which Paul Ryan sits on, really believed that the country was really a 2014 USA country, and that Trump was an interloper that had just confused things. That if they could just purge the party of Trump, they would go right back to 2014 overnight. The Republican senators think this. Republican House members think this. The RNC thinks this. And so Fox has been shocked that since they've tried to do any distance of Trump, their ratings have cratered. And they've been getting crushed over the last 3 months because they didn't embrace Trump late in the campaign, said he was going to lose Arizona when it was very close. The first ones to call that. They then were basically mostly critical or didn't give a platform for his election challenges. And so, people like Martha McCallum, they moved to the afternoon. They're trying to trying to go to a pure opinion structure. And the whole TV show Succession is loosely based on the Murdoch family. The Murdoch kids don't like their father's politics at all. Their wives really don't like their father's politics. So they wanted to get out of that of Papa Murdoch's shadow, and they thought the best way to do so was to disassociate from Trump, which Murdoch himself wanted to do. The problem now is they're discovering their brand is Murdoch convinced himself that the brand was bigger than Roger Ailes and then bigger than Donald Trump and bigger than conservatism, because Sky TV and other networks of his in England and Australia have been able to be more establishment Tory conservative than populist conservative and survive. He doesn't understand the American audience, and he's witnessing it. He should have. When Trump was critical of Fox in February of 2016, Fox took a 40% hit in their brand overnight in public opinion polling of their brand quality. So they knew they couldn't go at Trump, and yet they convinced themselves that once he was really going to be gone, they could. They're discovering otherwise. So there's a massive opening. One American News Network and Newsmax they're basically the default because there's nobody there really to compete with Fox but them. If Trump TV stepped into the place, and with the modern ability of streaming, with the ability to get around the regular broadcast channels, he doesn't need to have even control of those broadcast channels. He could build a media network overnight, and he knows it. And he knows that he could have 2 million, he could have half to 2/3 of Fox viewers watching him. Also, there's a part of his ego what you made the point about ego and revenge are factors with Trump. And Trump has been open about this. Go back to his Charlie Rose interviews, other interviews. He says one of his favorite things to do in life is to get back at people. Like he said his bankruptcy he didn't really mind because he said, it taught me, and well, I can tell you it's what he told me on the phone. He said, Bobby, this teaches you who your friends are and who aren't your friends. And he's the kind of guy who just remembers that. And so he's always had a little bit of an ego clash with Rupert Murdoch, put a revenge factor for him. He believes Murdoch helped cause his loss by how Fox handled him during the general election.
Oh, see, I never even thought about this. I was just thinking about the CNN Twitter angle.
It's across the board. So, but he particularly wants to crush Fox and punish Fox and pay Fox back. And so he had, in fact, there was whispers that he and Roger Ailes were thinking about doing this all the way back in 2016 in case he lost. And then Roger Ailes died, and then Trump won, so it all got put on hold. But Trump, one, he knows TV. 2, he has tons of contacts and connections in TV. 3, he's got the built-in audience. That the fact that so many people have left Fox to watch Newsmax and One American News Network, both of whom are decent. I like some people on there, but they're nowhere near what Trump could put on in terms of broadcasting quality and branding.
Right.
Trump could have over 1 million views a night right away. And the belief is, well, he'll be limited by corporate advertisers. The MyPillow guy will just quit advertising on Fox. All of the same people are advertising on Fox now that advertise on, say, Bongino and Rush Limbaugh and others. The other factor is he wants to ultimately have somebody replace Limbaugh, because there's going to be this other big vacuum, is that Limbaugh is not, his life expectancy is not expected to last another year. He might, but his health is really deteriorating fast. Mm-hmm. You have the guy that's dominated that space of media broadcasting for 25 years.
Right.
And the other, like Mark Levin, Laura Ingraham, these people are not really up to that level at all. So whereas Trump could find somebody, maybe even himself to some degree, who could step right in and replace him. So, and that's a guy that was making 25, 50 million a year, depending on where you put his estimates. So you combine, he wants to basically dominate it. Also, the point you made, what's more powerful than owning your entire media and social media network?
Right.
So
the presidency, in my opinion.
Exactly. He could have leaders fall and rise just by a push of the button, and he's willing to be much more aggressive than Murdoch ever was willing to be. So he doesn't need to help fundraise for a bunch of primary candidates that he wants to challenge people who undermined him or sabotaged him or betrayed him. He can just have his social media networks, TV networks, and radio networks and newspapers do it for him. And that's what all those other people would pay money for. So he wants to make a major, major difference. And that's where they think if they impeach him, totally unconstitutional impeachment, now we're going to have our first ever trial after impeachment for someone who's not in office. So which is completely unconstitutional by both Dershowitz and Turley's recognition. And you have a situation and circumstance where they admit they're not even going to have Justice Roberts preside over the trial because it's not a real impeachment trial because he's not in office. Well, then why are you having a trial, period? There is no constitutional right to impeach private citizens. So, but let's say they succeed. And let's say the Supreme Court doesn't set it aside like they should and says, okay, Trump is forever barred from running for office. That even gives them more motivation to own and run a media network.
And that gives him more ammunition. I think it gives him more viewers. That was one of the things that I was thinking through. If you're going to ban Trump from Twitter, or if you're going to ban him from XYZ social media, that's just going to make his following even stronger if or when he decides to move on to the next, to this media company that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And you look at Twitter, I mean, they've taken a 12% hit in their stock. And it's only holding on because there's not an easy competitor available.
Right.
What happens when Trump announces, I'm going to have my own Twitter? When Trump announces, I'm going to have my own Facebook? When Trump announces, I'm going to have my own TV network, my own radio network, all of that. At that point, I mean, I could see Twitter's value just completely collapsing. And then if foreign governments start saying, we don't like that Twitter thinks they can take our head of government off Twitter, like Uganda decided, we're just going to ban Twitter entirely, maybe ban them forever, not just for a couple of weeks. It shows the megalomania that consumes Jack Dorsey is a threat to its long-term stock value. And I know that there are shareholder class action lawyers right now already planning major suits against both Twitter and Facebook. Twitter is the easiest one because Twitter promised in their SEC statements that they would not discriminate based on political beliefs or political actions or political activities, and we're actually going to go out of their way to make sure they protected the maximum range of free speech. Well, clearly removing the guy that half of the Twitter interacted with on a daily basis, is not in conformity with those material statements. So there's allegations of material fraud on the market, and that's going to mean the damages are the same amount of damages that they've already lost in stock value. So that's going to double the scope of damages that Twitter may suffer. So it's not even clear to me how much Twitter even survives economically in a world without Trump, given the actions that they took, especially if Trump decides to start his own Twitter, which that was what I was hearing just several months ago. It was to launch a huge Trump media brand. Trump recognized he could no longer do the golf courses because they were going to discriminate against him as soon as he was out of office. He no longer could do high-end real estate, at least in the U.S. Internationally, Trump's brand is still not damaged in the way it is in the U.S. You'll see more international focus by Trump, particularly in the Middle East and in Latin America. But that's part of maybe it might not have been coincidental that Trump focused on improving his Latin and his Hispanic appeal in the United States. It wasn't just about the U.S. It was about being able to get access to Mexico, Central America, Latin America, potential markets for Trump real estate branded project. Right. But the big one is he's always seen it as he's always liked media, and he sees this as his perfect opportunity, and everybody's helping him. Facebook banning him is helping him because now if you want to get to Trump, you're probably only going to be able to see him on his own network or his own social media platform.
Yeah, where he's 100 cents on the dollar.
Exactly. He won't be available anywhere else. And he's got a hardcore following of somewhere around 30 to 40 million people that, are just Trumpists at heart. They care more. They did a recent poll, and these people said they're more Trump Republicans than Republicans. So, and he can leverage that politically with extraordinary ease. I think you'll see him he'll use the pretext of the banking exclusion to set up new banking relationships. Like, what would a Trump bank look like? There's nothing that could stop Trump from becoming a part shareholder or name brander on various banks that already exist, including banks that are more free with, say, crypto. And all of a sudden, how many customers, how many small businesses might go use a Trump bank? Not only that, I'm about to bring suit in a couple of weeks against a major bank in the United States that politically that discriminated against a guy that made them close to over $100 million, really, in net profit, invested in inner city communities that was one of the best, most successful inner city investors from an inner city perspective of anybody in the last 20 years. And solely because he's associated with Trump, they went to great efforts to discriminate against him in all of his contracts and cost him and his partners up to $100 million. So I'm going to bring suit. And when people realize if a bank's willing to do what they did to Trump, and if a bank's willing to do it to this guy, who is a nice, quiet, sweetheart political guy who's investing in the communities they claim to care about, what will they do to your line of credit at your local small business? So if you're anybody that needs capital and ever fear political bias being used against you in the banking or capital access world, well, who could step into the gap? A Trump bank. All of a sudden you could have, and that could be worldwide. That could also use crypto as a potential mechanism and means of currency exchange. So Trump is going to look at everything where his branding could be monetized and give him political influence. And that's primarily right now the media space, but that includes the tech media space, social media space, and it includes the banking finance space.
Yeah, so let's go back to what you're saying about your client that's having a hard time with the bank there, that they're discriminating against him for his views on Trump, let's say. That was one talking point I wanted to address and take a real deep dive on. And I don't even know if I can use the words because I'm sure YouTube will kind of ban it. But how can I get around this? We've got something that happens at home and we say that it's domestic. And we've got the acts of 9/11 that were terrorist attacks, let's say. So if you take domestic and we'll call it DT here for YouTube. What we've seen over the past few years is this term racist being used to describe quite literally anybody. I mean, we've broadened the term so much that it really doesn't even have meaning anymore. And we put so many people into that category. Do you think that we could put people who have, let's say, the Austrian view, so sound money, free market capitalism, and the more libertarian view, people who want to stand up for individual liberty, freedom, and people who value that personal liberty maybe more than they value safety, or maybe more than they value other people's feelings? Do you think that we could label them the DT word? And what type of problems do you think that would cause for those individuals in the future, whether it comes to banking, whether it comes to maybe their 9-to-5 job, maybe getting a loan? I mean, do they see this turning into a social score that's managed by the central planners who have a political narrative or a vision of the world that someone who's a libertarian or Austrian kind of who leans Austrian, who they don't share that same worldview? Or you see what I'm trying to say? I'm trying to tap dance around to not get in trouble with YouTube, but you see what I'm saying?
No question. I mean, what's happening is they're going to politically weaponize everything they have access to, whether that's access to education, access to employment, access to capital, access to credit, access to ultimately homes and everything else. I think the ultimate objective is what you've been talking about, is a government-controlled digital currency.
Right.
That allows them to do all of those things overnight. They want to have a one-stop shop where all of your assets and all of your access to capital and credit is controlled. They want that to be monopolized. And then if you've been politically bad, if you've voiced a dissident form of behavior, no rent for you this week. No food for you tomorrow. No taking an Uber. In fact, it's like that X-Files episode where in the more recent X-Files, where they did like 6 new episodes, where they go to an automated future and they walk into this sushi restaurant. It's all done by automated chefs. And he doesn't like the Mulder character, doesn't like the way his sushi came out. So he doesn't give him a good review. And because they didn't get a good customer review, all of a sudden, the automated taxi tries to kill one of them. The automated vacuum cleaner tries to put the house on fire. The automated security system locks them in while the house is on fire. Right. Then the automated drones start to attack them, like the Birds movie from Hitchcock. So it's all the ways in which automated society can ruin your life. Well, the same thing is they're trying to weaponize all the forms of power. And what they've come to realize is the best way to do so is not do it through the state formally. Now, I think they're setting it up for the state to do it ultimately. But right now, if you can get private tech companies, if you can get private banks to do it, private businesses to do it for you in the name of originally racial discrimination, but now because any belief you have somehow supports the racial oppressive hierarchy and whatnot, or sexist patriarchy, they found it's much easier for a broad, generic label that sounds terrifying, where we have a bunch of law. Like there's a bunch of law about aiding and abetting and enabling and financially, what they call materially supporting various movements that have that label attached to it. All of a sudden, all your rights vanish and disappear. But historically, that's only been allowed in the foreign context because the theory is it doesn't apply to U.S. citizens and it's only being applied to under the guise of foreign relations. And there the executive branch has much broader carte blanche authority constitutionally than it does over domestic citizens. They have always wanted to take the Patriot Act and have Part 2, the sequel, apply entirely to domestic citizens. What people don't know is the first Patriot Act was drafted in 1995, trying to use Oklahoma City as the political pretext to push it through. And its initial targets were not foreigners or those enabling people from outside the United States, but was entirely domestically. Because it led to a outrage, it didn't pass. Well, guess who the author of that first Patriot Act was? A senator from Delaware named Joe Biden. So it is now Patriot Act number 2 has already been written. A day after January 6th, it got leaked through some think tanks. They already had a 20,000-page Patriot Act number 2 ready to go. And they're going to use the T word because the T word has this legal history of basically eviscerating all of your constitutional rights and restrictions.
Right.
And now, theoretically, the reason for that was that it was foreign. So once it's domestic, the Constitution is supposed to kick in. But you already have congressmen and senators talking about merely attending a MAGA rally means you should have the T word put on your head.
Yeah, see, that's where I'm going. So let's take the viewer, the listener through the thought process here. So we'll just go ahead and say it. We'll let YouTube do what they want to do. So we're talking about labeling people as a domestic terrorist. So going back to 1995, Oklahoma, that what happened there, that's an act of what some people would consider domestic terrorism. But we've gone from that to looking at what happened at the White House the other day with the protests, riots, whatever you want to call them. Now that's domestic terrorism. And it's being labeled domestic terrorism, in my mind, by some, just because those individuals who were protesting, I'm not saying what they did was right, but those individuals had one political belief system that was contrary to their own. And so my point is, now that that window is kind of moving in what we consider to be domestic terrorists, is really that's broadening dramatically. So at what point do we say, okay, someone that believes in maybe that there shouldn't be mask lockdowns, are they now a domestic terrorist? Someone that believes in the value of gold, let's say, as sound money, are they a domestic terrorist? Where are we going to draw the line, or is it like the word racism? Is it going to continue to expand and expand and expand? And then is there going to be deplatforming? Is there going to be legal ramifications for people who believe in small government and personal liberty, that we've got to punish these people because they're a threat to our domestic society? I mean, yeah, that's where I was really going with it when I was tap dancing around there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's no question. I think it's absolutely where they plan on going. So you're right. It goes to Alice in Wonderland, where Humpty Dumpty says, "A word is what I say it is." It's that kind of, brilliant foresight of where language was going to go. And that was because the communist left was very good at double speak. We now call it Orwellian language for a reason,
Right.
because Orwell was describing it. He was really just describing it. He wasn't even predicting it. He was just seeing what he was seeing and reporting it back, sometimes disguised as fiction, the way James Ellroy or John Le Carre will write in a way that is actually just reality, but disguised in a fictional narrative to get the truth out. So they're absolutely going to go that route. How they defined race and how they became so elastic is how the word terror is going to be used. And there's no better example than what they've done to the president. So they're resurrecting legal doctrines like insurrection and sedition that most people thought were dead and buried because they've been
so what does that word mean? I've heard that being thrown around on all the news networks. And what does that mean exactly?
All insurrection is very limited. So, the 1808, the Insurrection Act passed, and it meant when there was literally an insurrection. So like the Whiskey Tax Rebellion of Western Pennsylvania after the Constitution's passage, or actually after the Articles of Confederation and the American Revolution phrase before the Constitution, was an insurrection where they were actually trying to overthrow the government. So that's what insurrection meant. That's where it came from, an armed resistance. The only other time it really applied in the United States history is really 1860 in the Civil War. People have but you can imagine how politically that's a very elastic word potentially in its definition, because you look at and the same thing is true of sedition laws. So sedition laws have an ugly history going back to the 13th century. The king basically decided anybody who criticizes me should go to prison. So he called it criminal sedition. In fact, you could go to prison in England. It didn't even have to be false statements about the king. It could be true statements about the king. And it was considered sedition if it would lead to people not having confidence and trust in him. And there's language like that in the sedition statutes. So we use so John Adams passed them in the 1798 Alien and Sedition Acts to try to put people who printed press against him in prison. Thomas Jefferson and others hated the law. Ultimately, Jefferson gets elected. They throw out the law, and he pardons everybody who was ever fined under the law. Right. It doesn't come back until World War I. It's always during these so-called crises that these massive usurpation of civil liberties occurs. We pass some more sedition acts. Eugene V. Debs went to prison for a speech under the Sedition Act. That's how ridiculous these speeches. That's how ridiculous. It was, if you opposed the war, that meant you were trying to have an insurrection against the country, and hence you were guilty of sedition, and he went to prison. And so we've always recognized that these are bad laws, but that the courts basically cave and capitulate during times of perceived political crisis. The whole New York Times versus Sullivan decision, that was a state version of a sedition law. It wasn't just libel. And that was the first time the U.S. Supreme Court made clear sedition laws violate the First Amendment. You cannot put people in prison for their speech. You cannot punish people for their speech. But they're about to do it to the President of the United States. He said have a peaceful and patriotic rally, and somebody else 30 minutes earlier was doing something illegal, and now he's being blamed for conspiracy to commit incitement and insurrection. And so it's especially to relay, you could label every single riot that's ever occurred in insurrection, because the law, you read the language of it, it's anything that brings the government into disrepute in the sedition context. In the insurrection context, it's anything that challenges the authority of the government. That's,
Yeah,
I mean,
but
everybody challenges the authority of the government every day in some capacity politically.
yeah, when you're talking about the sedition, I mean, what's going through my mind is the issue I had on this platform, where they took down one of my videos because, according to them, it conflicted with their policy about disagreeing with, let's say, local policy about how they were handling the cerveza sickness. And I was just presenting facts, and my takeaway was that I just felt as though the government should be out of it, and it should be left up to the individual. And they took it down. Now, to their defense, they put it back up and they apologized. They said that they had made a mistake, but they pointed out that that was a certain component of that was against their policy. So where I'm going with that is, I'm just, when you're talking about the sedition stuff, I'm thinking about maybe in the future, because our economy is so reliant now upon stimulus. If you came out and disagreed or opposed a new stimulus package, you could see how people that were on the extreme, I don't want to say extreme left, because I don't want to miscategorize anyone or be too general, but you could see how people that felt as though there needed to be a more authoritarian approach to how we're handling freedom of speech, let's say, how they could say that should be categorized as sedition. You know, just the fact that you're disagreeing with stimulus because it's so vital to the American economy right now. I mean, do you think we could get to that point?
Oh, absolutely, because it's an extension of safe space idolatry. So, you know, what Jonathan Haidt and other people have talked about is the safe space culture. These kids grew up in the mid-late 90s because of the kidnapping scares that took place and the child abuse scares that took place. That you know, you only went on play dates. You didn't play in the street. You didn't play in the park. It's extended to, if you do anything that makes me feel triggered, that makes me feel sad or angry, then that must be punished and prohibited. And when you take that ideology and apply it to the state, and basically it's easy for them to say, oh, that seems like terrorism to me. What you're doing is you're terrorizing me because you're saying something that deeply offends and upsets me. So that can be anything. That can be any degree of disagreement with those in authority and those in power. And it's where they're going to go. And if people want the best analogy, go back and look at the way Orwell described the rising communist empire in the East and in Russia, and the way they use language especially. That's the world we're going to. You're going to keep getting shocked until you say, I'm sorry, 2 + 2 does equal 5.
Yeah, right. And I want to be very clear here, Robert. I know we've had this discussion before, but maybe some of the listeners and viewers haven't listened to all of our previous interviews, where you talked about, because I know what's going through probably a lot of people's minds right now is, well, that's never going to happen because that's against the law. That's against the law, and the law protects me as an individual American. The Constitution protects me, and therefore that's never going to happen, like maybe Robert is describing, or how George is talking about potentially happening in the future. Again, I'm not saying that any of this is going to happen. We're just thinking this through so that we can all kind of be prepared as to what the variables that we're dealing with are here. But my point was, you and I have discussed it, and I'd like you to expand on this, that it's really not about the law anymore. It's not about your constitutional rights. We've gone from being a country and a society of laws to a country and a society of men. And that however the wind is blowing that day, as far as the political narrative in that local jurisdiction, is how you're going to be either found guilty or innocent. Can you expand on that?
Absolutely. So I always give 2 analogies. It's like the Indian tribes waving their treaties as the cavalry came. Those were nice pieces of paper. They just didn't work particularly well to stop the cavalry. Or as they say in Mexico, constitution made of paper, blade made of steel. Mm-hmm. And so we're always at some level governed by people who it's only the degree to which they believe, the people in power believe that the Constitution restrains them and the rule of law restrains them, that it actually restrains them. And we are entering an era, and have been for the last 2 decades, it's just been escalating, where the people in positions of power do not care about these restraints. Right. I mean, we see a president of the United States. People had told me Facebook and Twitter will never block the elected president of the United States from communicating to his own citizens, especially during a crisis. Yet that's exactly what both of them just did. Right. They also told me, don't worry, Congress will never consider something like objecting to elections and objecting to electors. Well, members of the House and the Senate have been doing that since 1809 for more than 200 years. They objected in 1809, and they objected to the 1808 election, the 1816 election, the 1820 election, the 1836 election, the 1872 election, the 1876 election, and the 1968 election, and Nixon had to deal with issues in 1960. And yet, the senators, well-regarded senators in Hawley and Cruz, considered future presidential candidates, they're now asking that they be expelled from the Senate solely for casting a vote objecting to an electors, and they're asking that their colleges and law schools revoke their degrees, and that the bars that license them revoke their law licenses. Right. These are things that have never been considered constitutional, and yet they're under serious contemplation and consideration. Right. Lawyers who had 2 lawyers, well-respected, well-regarded, Cleta Mitchell and John Eastman, who simply helped the president deal with the constitutional issues concerning the election, both of them lost their jobs at law firms that were generally considered to the right of center law firms, simply for representing their client. So a lot of things that people have said, don't worry, that can never happen, we've witnessed actually happen. And
right. And things where you're supposed to be protected by the law, and you just aren't. Where it's mob rule, it's not rule of law.
Absolutely, it's the rule of politicians, and that's you're governed by whoever happens to have the badge at the time. It always reminds me of that the movie where Clint Eastwood comes back into town to get revenge, and paints the whole town red and all that. But at one point, he makes the little midget the mayor and the sheriff. And he's standing on the bar and he's saying, I'm the mayor, I'm the sheriff. And the point of it is to sort of mock the idea of power and how power is dependent on the whim of a person at the end of the day. And we're just seeing that at a different scale. In other words, once they're willing to illicitly punish the president of the United States for his speech, why in the world wouldn't they do it to some ordinary Joe or Schmo? I'm representing a librarian, city of Flagstaff in Arizona. It's almost a decade-long service. What did he get fired for? He just asked for libraries to quit being overtly political with their jobs. He didn't even ask him to support Trump. Now the law is clear. First Amendment says you can't do that. And yet they did anyway. Why? Because they believe courts won't do anything about it. And we witnessed courts not doing any. I mean, we just had a presidential election which had more controversy attached to it than any presidential election since 1876. But now, if you even talk in detail about it, you will be banned and censored. Calls for your law degree and college degrees to be revoked. Calls for you to be expelled from any office position of power that you hold. Calls for banks to not allow you to use their systems for credit or capital. And basically calls to completely sort of blacklist you from civil society. Right now, there are people that worked in the Trump administration who are being blacklisted from any form of employment, even low-level, medium-level jobs. So they have weaponized every aspect of the private justice system. And what happened to all the courts during these election challenges? All of them found a way not to rule on the substantive merits for the most part. So what does that tell you? If Trump's own appointees wouldn't come to Trump's rescue to deal with major constitutional questions about something as important as the constitutionality of the election, why in the world are they going to enforce the Constitution for mom and pop shop on some street in Scranton?
Yeah, and they're obviously trying to control with fear. And that's my point whenever someone talks to me about the freedom of speech that we have in the Constitution and how that's a huge benefit to the United States. I agree, but in practice, even if you have the legal right to say something, if you're afraid to say something, is that legal? How much value does that legal right actually have?
Well, that's Chomsky's whole point, that self-censorship is often as effective or more effective than state censorship. Right. If you can induce people to not, and look at, that was the whole experience of the Soviet Union. For the most part, they didn't have to punish people for their speech because they got people scared to make speech. And the Soviet Constitution also had fantastic protections for freedom of speech and freedom of association. Fidel Castro spoke in defense of freedom of speech and freedom of press. How did those societies turn out to be? So it comes back to a constitution is only as good as the people who have positions of power in it.
Right. That's a great point. Okay, so I know we're running a little short on time. We've kind of painted the picture for most people and gone over what we believe what we believe the future could look like from a standpoint of personal freedom, laws or lack thereove, and how the people watching this, if they believe that we should have smaller government, more personal liberty, if they believe that the government should not spend as much money as they're spending, if they maybe say, I would like a business to have the right to determine whether or not they want to open, that could fall under a category where you could get some serious blowback in your actual life as a result. So we've gone over that. I want to go over what people can do, if anything at all, focusing on Americans to protect themselves, and maybe circling back. I mean, in my whiteboard video the other day, I went over some drawbacks to potentially the Trump News Network. I did go over one positive thing, and that's that I think they would be completely opposed to the Great Reset agenda with the World Economic Forum. But so my question is, what can people do to protect themselves? And do you see maybe the Trump News Network being a way to combat the direction that we're headed from a standpoint of personal liberty?
I see it as a bifurcated approach and fitting within the Donald Trump strategy of plan for the best, hope for the worst. I'm sorry, hope for the best, plan for the worst. And that is, on one step, people can make a strategic contribution to pushing back in a wide range of ways, whether that's supporting a sort of legal onslaught on the system to fight back at every meaningful way conceivable, to try to find a honest judge or a honest jury that will do something about it, but merely fighting back sends a message to the system. Once they hear a certain amount of noise, they tend to fall back, because at the end of the day, the fifth pillar of power is the perception of the other four pillars of power. And if you remove that fifth pillar of power, the other four pillars of power collapse. And this is what the Einstein Institute, which was CIA backed, used to teach the color revolutionaries in Eastern Europe in the 90s and 2000s. So they know it, and they know that the perception of power, the reason why they do so much gaslighting, is they need public compliance and acquiescence. The more pushback, the better. Whether that's supporting independent content creators, whether that's supporting independent technological means of distribution of information, distribution of resources, whether that's cryptocurrency, whether that's Gab, whether that's anything, whether that's locals, whether it's anything like that, whether that's participation in helping primary opponents, helping crowdfund or spread the message of challenging institutional narratives. All of that, I think there are ways to push back and fight back that are meaningful and could be successful. So I recommend that strategy on the one hand, which is dependent on each individual, what they feel they can do and should do. And the other is prepare for the worst and plan for the worst, and have a born identity package sitting in a suitcase in the back of a car that's not necessarily titled in your name, or an RV that has a phone that's completely detached from Google and isn't trackable or traceable, that has a laptop that has independent communications means that isn't an IP associated or attached to you, that has currency in 4 or 5 different countries, so you can get to where you need when you need. That has a definitely have some Bitcoin cryptocurrency that cannot be as easily shut off and shut down as is the case with our U.S. banking account systems. Multiple identities where possible, and or I should say multiple passports, means of travel and access to other countries and other nations. And there was plan like if you were in Berlin and you're Jewish and it's 1929. Right. And the plan accordingly. So hope that the world turns into a great paradise like Babylon, Berlin kind of looked to be in 1929. The Nazi Party prior to 1928, 1929 had never achieved more than 5% support. When horrible change happens, it tends to happen very, very fast. And we're seeing the early warning signs of it. So one way to defeat it is to resist it and push back. But for the protection of your individual liberty, I mean, why is Bill Gates the guy that owns the most farmland in the world right now? And you think Bill Gates, with all of his patent developments for artificial foods and genetically modified foods, is where you want to go for your future food supply? And as you've talked about, having your own little farm operation or connection to an independent farm. All of those kind of things are useful. Independent land, independent means of travel, independent means of citizenship, independent means of access of communication, independent means of exchange in the forms of currency or other barterable items. Having as much state, what I call jurisdictional diversification, right, so that you're not dependent on any one state's governance for your freedoms and liberties. If you are extraordinarily and exceptionally vulnerable, especially right now.
Yeah. And then do you think that the Trump News Network is going to push back and hopefully decentralize things? Do you think they're going to fight against those who want to take this authoritarian approach to free speech in the future?
I think it'll be even more populist in orientation because that's where his audience is. So like when he was president, he had to balance his populist wing and conservative traditional wing. Now the traditional wing will stay with the Foxes of the world. So he will double down and be more aggressive on his populist libertarian wing. That's where he has the most growth from a pure marketing perspective. And that's the way Trump thinks. Trump goes wherever the votes are. Trump goes wherever the dollars are. Trump goes wherever the audience is. And the audience is going to be very populist, independent, and liberty-oriented. So I think you'll see him double down on that. Like when he was running for office, he focused on who was most popular amongst the broadest range of independent voices on the right. And he found it was Alex Jones and Michael Savage. So you'll see him repeat and replicate, and his initial campaign structure was built off Alex Jones. So like his core audience initially overlapped in demographically extraordinarily with Jones's audience. So I think if you see that, he'll replicate something like that. He'll build something that's very populist, very independent, it will have probably a bigger cross section of people than Jones's audience does and be broader. But it will be similarly situated in mindset. So it'll be also, I think you'll see people like Jones and Savage and the rest return to their more hardcore populist independent roots. And it was very anti-surveillance state, anti-empire, anti-Wall Street, anti-the Washington establishment, anti-Fed. All of those things you'll start to see really reinvigorated. Like a lot of criticism of the Fed really got buried during Trump's era because Trump dominated so much of the dialogue and debate. With Trump gone, and people are now just starting to realize how much money got printed over the last year, and with Biden, and he's so openly, cravenly corrupt in his method of operation and who he's putting into his cabinet, and his announcement last night that, hey, we need at least another $2 trillion just to start. Let's get those printers up and burn. I think that there'll be more attention back to the real core institutions of problematic areas of power, and I think Trump TV will help facilitate that. Trump used to be more anti-Fed when he ran. He backed off because he needed their cooperation economically to not do too much harm to him for his reelection prospects. I think you'll see him now return to more anti-Fed politics, anti-bank politics. I mean, the banks are giving him every motivation. I mean, if Deutsche Bank thinks this is the end of the issues relating to Trump, it's just beginning. Does anyone think Trump is going to forget what they just did to him and these other banks did to him? He's going to build Trump TV network to do every investigative reporting analysis on Deutsche Bank in the last 20 years. And Deutsche Bank has some scandals sitting there. So they have just unleashed some. They're hoping they can attack him so much that he will go gently into the good night. But if anybody knows Trump, he wouldn't need a Dylan Thomas poem to tell him not to go gently into the good night and to rage against the dying of the light, because Trump was born raging against the dying of the light.
Yeah, that's what I tried to hit at in that video I did. Is I just don't think that's a part of his personality at all, all. And then he's got perennially all kids around him too to take the reins and keep it moving into the future. So bottom line is, it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out. And the world is changing quickly, and everyone needs to be cognizant of what's going on, and they need to have a plan B. I think that's the real takeaway. So, Robert, as I said at the very beginning of the interview, I just really look forward to the time that we get to talk, and I learned so much. And this interview is the exact same thing. I've learned a lot, and you really got me thinking. Whenever I talk to you, the next 4 or 5 hours, I'm just thinking about our conversation the whole time. So thank you very much for that. For my viewers or listeners who want to find out more about what you do, where can they go?
Sure. One of two places, or one of three places. The website for the law firm is barneslawllp.com. There's also, I started a law center to deal with a lot of these issues, or help start it, called the Free America Law Center. That's www.freeamericalawcenter.com. And I started a locals page to curate a community that's independent of big tech censorship and suppression, where we provide independent information. And that's vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
Fantastic. All right, buddy. I'll let you get back to what you're doing, and appreciate your time. Can't wait to do it again.
Absolutely. Always good.